the call last month. I'm sorry that I was unable to do it. I was like, I had a like 1 day old kid or something. I don't remember what it was, but it was not a good time to try and like be sane. So I couldn't do it, but I watched the video. It was great. Let's see. So Boss had also requested that we don't make any like giant decisions or anything today, which I think is reasonable. August seems like a month where it's difficult to find a time that works for everyone, but I don't think that should be a big problem. I also wanted to introduce Jonathan Caldor. He and Facebook joined the IAB, I don't know, a few weeks ago or something. Jonathan, do you want to just say a few words about your background, what you've been doing there?
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so hi, name's Jonathan. I work at Facebook. I guess if we're going all background, I'm coming originally from a computer graphics background, doing cloth simulation. Came to Facebook. I've been working on the tracing team here for about 3 years now, with 3 years before that working on mobile and Android. And so we've basically developed an in-house tracing system that we've deployed across both our distributed backend services, our web tier, and our mobile applications. And we've been talking both with Yuri and Ben about like problems in tracing.
Greetings.
Yep, nice to meet you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. The purpose of the Industrial Advisory Board isn't strictly to find people who are using OpenTracing, but just to find people who are using tracing and can help us like, inform future feature development and so on, as opposed to creating kind of like a cycle in the graph where we don't get feedback from the outside world. And the work that Facebook has done is pretty interesting, and they've also been nice enough to publish some of it. So yeah, it's great to have you here. Anyway, Ed, do you want to talk about that spring cleaning thing? I'm just going down the agenda for this call.
Yeah. So I feel like the GitHub issues sections on various projects have started to get a little dusty and long in the tooth. So I'm just going to be going around the next couple of weeks and for all outstanding issues that don't look like they're actively moving, try to either get them closed or archived or get people to start moving on them again. So I did this once before with Java, and so just another round of that. So if you see me in there asking questions, that's why.
Sounds great. I think from like an actual PR and API standpoint, like the most at least to my knowledge, the most debate has been going on around this active span thing. So for context, I don't know, I can't get my month straight, but I'd say like 3 or 4 months ago, we merged in active span support into Java, which is, for those who aren't like intimately involved in this stuff, was basically the feature that allowed you to statically determine what the current span was in the distributed trace. So there was a static lookup to find the global tracer, and then the global tracer had this new capability to give you the active span. In order to make that happen, there were a bunch of other APIs that had to be modified. And that went in with a great deal of review in the sense that the PR literally was breaking GitHub and generating 500s because there are too many comments, but it wasn't reviewed by everyone who would care about it. So there's sort of like this issue where it had a lot of scrutiny, but not necessarily scrutiny from everyone who's affected by it. That went out. And then I think crucially, like the Zipkin Brave bindings to that, like for whatever, reasons aside, like I think Adrian was like really unhappy about much of the design decisions that went into that PR. And others were also sort of like, well, yeah, I wasn't actually that happy with like this aspect of it or that aspect of it either. And these things came out sort of after it had been merged into master. So the options, of course, would be to say, well, sorry, like you had your chance, or to try and fix it. I think obviously we're trying to fix it given the maturity of the project and how much this feature in my mind is probably like a linchpin of making tracing in general easier to use. Like this is the thing that's like going to make not just open tracing, but tracing in general, like more kind of portable across package boundaries. So it's pretty important to get it right. I have a PR that I sent out, which is linked in the doc. It's Java PR 166. That's kind of like a RFC for a way to address the concerns that have been expressed with the current API. And on that thread, and I think also on the specification thread, there are some other suggestions for ways to mitigate some of the issues that people are having with the current API. I would like, I don't think I could underline enough how helpful it would be to have other people making concrete proposals, even if they have warts or aren't fully baked or whatever. I think this has more potential to impact, like the way the industry uses tracing than just about any other set of changes that we're making, especially given the proliferation of Java JVM stuff. And I would also say whatever we decide to do in Java is going to not necessarily dictate, but will certainly like have heavy influence in PRs in Python and PHP that are kind of stalled waiting for this debate to land. So it just like there's a plug to kind of take a look at it. I'm trying not to rush it just because of the experience with the last time we did this. But that said, of course, like sooner is better and all that. So yeah, please, take a look and any comments are welcome, even if they're incomplete or not fully thought out. Like we'll sort out the thinking out ourselves if you don't have time to do it, but it would just be great to get those opinions. Are there other thoughts about this particular topic since I'm just sort of rambling?
I just wanted to say, in general, I'm drafting a sort of proposal for how we do these API changes in the future, just like Ben was saying, to make sure we have a sort of checklist or some approach so that we don't end up in a situation where someone is like, oh, yeah, it matters what I think, but I didn't say anything or I didn't know, those kinds of situations. And then my other meta note is, yeah, I think code is helpful. I feel like with these discussions, they're so technical and arcane, and it's so easy for people to speak past each other. Like colloquial English in like a giant PR thread just sort of like runs out of steam. Like you get a certain amount of consensus, but it seems like it's very difficult to get over that final hump just with colloquial English. And so that's where some more programmatic way of driving these things out or driving discussion out past a certain point, I think is necessary. So make some more PRs, people.
Ted, on that point, I think it might be useful even to resolve this PR to start applying the principles from the EO doc, especially like defining the exactly the use cases and maybe examples, code examples and tests, so that otherwise, because the people do make alternative proposal already, at least I have seen 2 in that PR, but it's like, it's impossible to say whether those proposals actually cover all the use cases just by looking at that code. So rather than even just posting a new API change to the PR, it's better to have some sort of a harness saying, yes, this is how it solves it.
Yeah, I find it specifically the issue where people are like, well, why not this simpler API? And it's hard to tell just from looking at the code snippet of that API interface whether there's something that's been forgotten and that's why it's simpler because it doesn't work, or like, is it really simpler? That's where we really need some of this. Yeah.
So I would suggest like an action item is to maybe for some core contributors to come up with this list of use cases and some maybe code examples that demonstrate those use cases. And then if anyone proposes a different API, then they should show how that API covers all those examples or addresses them. I don't know if we can automate that, but at least just a evaluation would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't think it can be automated for API changes because it's difficult to try to harness against an API that's actually literally in flux as part of the PR. But I do think it's reasonable to say, here are some situations that come up in real software, like how is your PR going to address this? And so you'd have to make some trivial modifications. And if they're not trivial, then your solution doesn't work, right? So it's like, these are things that need to be easy and need to be covered. And I think that's a wonderful idea.
So one thing that might help this case is having like a set of specific tests that go along with, like, that basically exercise the API in a semi-realistic way that, you know, as the API evolves, then you can see how those tests change to kind of give you a better picture on how the real world usage would be. And I think some of the other languages have this to some degree, but Java, I think, is still lacking on that in terms of like an actual test suite. And that would be useful for trace implementers too.
Yeah, for sure. Not just for figuring these things out, but also like what you're saying, like compliance, being able to identify which tracers do or don't work with which version. Like, yeah, just having that superstructure there would also make it easier for people then to add new test cases and things as they come up.
Yeah, and this has come up on the interwebs as well as a gap in OpenTracing Java ecosystem. And I mean, I think everyone agrees that it's beneficial. I'm like personally like swamped is like not even the right word, but I'm like time bankrupt completely. But I know I completely agree. It might be something that maybe we can just pay someone to do it or something. It's not like it's that difficult. It just needs to get done, and it's just not getting to the top of the queue. OpenTracing certified, right? That's right, certainly. Yeah.
I think the as in Go is like a good prototype to do that. It's like I think Chris mentioned once that he was able to get like 100% test coverage from his tracer just by running that harness. So that's kind of the awesome state to be.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, pretty much all the tests that got me to 100% that were applicable to any tracer, I was sure to put in the harness. And then there was a couple of specific things that were related to configuration. But yeah, I'm gonna finish that PR, Yuri, I promise. Like this weekend, there's like just a handful of little things that I think are blocking it from being merged, but it should go out soon.
Wait, I'll be in there spring cleaning and harassing your issue.
See, there you go.
All right, so let's see. I think looking through the agenda, there's a few more things related to this active span stuff that are just kind of there almost for reference, and I'm not going to walk through them. I don't think that's a very useful way to spend our time. I think I'm probably not the right person to summarize all the updates in Contrib, and I'm not confident that the list here is actually complete, but I don't know. I think, Ted, you put the Spring instrumentation thing. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. Sadly, Pavel's not on the call because he's heading that up. But this is just an attempt to sort of coordinate the various pieces of Spring instrumentation that are coming in. There are certain parts of the Spring ecosystem that directly need to be instrumented. But then there are other parts where it's actually much more like configuration and auto configuration. Just, configure this higher order component to use the instrumentation in, this lower order component that it uses for RPC or something. And then also this issue around, do all of the dependencies for all these instrumentations work together? Because all the Spring stuff has to work together. So there's a project now in OpenTracing Contrib called Java Spring Cloud. That's sort of this meta repo. It's kind of modeled on Spring Sleuth, which is an existing system that works with Sipkin. Unfortunately, it's not really feasible to try to plug OpenTracing tracers into that system, and for very reasonable reasons, they don't want to switch to OpenTracing because that would be a big change for them. So this is just sort of a way to kind of corral our own ecosystem of instrumentation for Spring, if that makes sense. And we would love, of course, help if you're interested in Spring. Please try these things out and help us get the auto configurations in there. Any questions? Cool.
I would say I just put something in the chat thing that there's been the Hocular / Jaeger folks have been doing a nice job like documenting some of their work, and I just put a link to like their JaxRS thing. Yuri, I remember sorry if this is more than a month ago and it happened last call, which I missed, but you all had some announcement around like OpenShift something or other, is that right?
We had OpenShift has this developer community meetings, and we had a talk, myself and Gary. Essentially, it was a Jaeger presentation, and then Gary had a example of metrics from Java, OpenTracing Java.
How was that received?
Well, I think it's like the actual call doesn't have that many listeners. It's more of a kind of, it goes on a blog post afterwards as a video, so it's available.
Yeah.
You can probably share it here.
Got it. There were a few things that have been proposed. I think Chris Irway proposed the parent up thing, is that correct?
Yeah, and then I realized that John Mace proposed it after the Berlin meeting as well. And so in a sense, I filed a redundant issue that Ted will probably close and replace with the original two. It's two things, right? Like you have to be able to add a reference after the span's been created in order to make a parent of in some cases, if you're getting a response header or if something's folding in or doing a fan in situation, there's you could see needing to add a reference after a span's been created, and right now you can only do that at the beginning. So John's got two issues for each of those concerns.
Cool.
I feel like this is often a core thing that comes up with these API changes of, on the one hand, we want, there's all this situation where, yeah, you have to do things after you've started the span just because that's the way it works out. But then some tracers get concerned about things just however they work. They want to front load some work or send this span message out, and they have difficulty with things being dynamic or mutable. I don't think this is necessarily a case of that. But I've just noticed that's the main way these kinds of things tend to be contentious. That's probably not relevant for this one because we're talking about references and parentage, but my meta comment.
Yeah, I was actually kind of curious the reason, if there was any thought about it needing to be immutable, the set of parents when you create a child span. Was there any reason for that, or was it just because it was the simplest use case? And like tags you can add at any point, right? There.
The thinking behind it, I think, well, part of it is that it's easier to go it's easier to add capabilities than to remove them or whatever, that kind of thing. And then the other piece of it was that for some implementations, the way the span gets constructed depends on the context at initialization. So like the most obvious example is that if you're in the kind of Zipkin,
yeah,
and well, the earlier Zipkin and Dapper model where you have a single span ID shared across client and server, you need to know at like construction time that you're like doing that. And so, or you have to like make a bunch of immutable structures mutable, which is messy. So I think that was the implementation concern that was driving that, like from a, use cases standpoint. And then I could come up with some kind of like conceptual argument, but those are probably weaker.
I see. like that CS stuff.
So,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, I mean, it's a little weak. I actually had coffee with Rodrigo Fonseca 2 days ago and talked a bunch
Nice.
about their tracing plane stuff, which I think is a lot more like elegant than any of the like anything that's happening in industry for the most part. And we were talking about this type of thing a little bit too, and it does feel like the desire to add these context references during the span lifetime probably reflects like a weakness in the span model more than anything else. Like that's my like 2 cents about it. You know, like it. If the timestamp at which the thing is added like matters at all, which I think in some cases it does, like it's almost like it's like it really probably better off as like in open tracing terminology is like a log event that you're logging with additional reference and not just like an attribute on the span. Like it probably matters what time it happened if it wasn't available before the span started. So that's what's always hung me up on this in the past. It just feels
Yeah.
like open tracing enshrines the importance of an event where a span starts and a span stops. But if you get like really pure and theoretical about it, like it should just be one big event stream with ordered dependencies, and then all this becomes much more elegant, although of course it also becomes like a lot harder to use. Well, I would argue it becomes a bit harder to like reason about and use in industrial code, but I don't know. You might disagree with that, Chris, since I know that you all have actually managed to implement an S3 system.
Well, yeah, I guess you're right about the log event issue. Yeah, it would be nice to have a timestamp, but it's not. Yeah, the model would be losing that information.
I think one other point of information that would be useful that we don't currently capture in a lot of cases is whether a span is blocking versus not blocking the overall context. Just as a way of like distinguishing, yeah, this piece of information might be useful or this other thing might not. Or like this span is what's causing it to take so long versus this other span that is asynchronous and not doing anything, but also interesting. Anyway, sorry for jumping in there.
That's great.
I mean, if you're talking about back to the tracing plane stuff, the baggage propagation up is like the main thing that's different. Apart from reference types and logging events, it's like how to handle baggage propagation back up the trace, whether to handle it. I noticed that the OpenTracing spec, it only really says it goes down, each child inherits a copy, and the downwards, and the upwards sounds like a huge can of worms. Across processes, it's easier. In process, it sounds awful, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone propagating baggage up in the process. But yeah, I guess that's kind of outside the scope of OpenTracing, I assume, is is baggage propagation up. Like I wasn't trying to push for that at all, but you could see a lot of use cases, right, for propagating a taint flag or all kinds of different reasons why you could use such a facility.
That does bring up an interesting question. I mean, since there are various folks here from organizations that actually implement tracing, I'm sort of looking at Bruce and Jonathan, I guess, like to do what you're suggesting, Chris, would be really nice. Like theoretically, it would resolve a lot of uncertainty around clock skew and so on, but would also require that somehow data gets sent on the way up the stack and not just on the way down the stack through request headers. I guess, is that normally done through response headers or something? Like what do people usually do in practice, Chris? Is that the story? Like I don't have a great sense of like whether anyone's doing things like that for other purposes or not at Facebook or at Twilio or whatever, but I'm curious to hear about it. It makes me I don't want to bias with my feelings about it.
Not currently, but I could actually see that potentially being something we would do because Twilio isn't. What I've had to wrap my head around is that Twilio has our API edge, but we also have a carrier edge on the other end, and because we're a transit. So that kind of makes our systems very interesting to trace, because it's not just like here's the front door and everything goes down. We actually do have multiple edges in common systems like that. So like a lot of the stuff around webhooks might be interesting. So propagating the webhook responses back up for different cases, which is kind of weird in this case, because it's like that's a part of, as an API, that's part of the system that is somewhat of a customer dependency and customer driven, but we have had issues with webhooks being broken for one reason or another. Trying to figure those things out is where I would think you see that.
Yeah, on our side, I can't think of any cases where we propagate stuff back up for purposes of tracing. We're looking at cases where we can propagate stuff back up in the response header to integrate with tracing, but we've generally shied away from a lot of the baggage propagation stuff, although we're thinking about, like, basically we want to make sure that it's like as stripped down and as limited as possible, because of just people abusing, in general, you probably people abusing tracing anyways, and allowing them the capability to sort of transmit stuff arbitrarily around through the stack would probably cause them to abuse it even more. So yeah, it's not something certainly propagating stuff back up we haven't considered.
I also forgot that Stephen was on the call because he doesn't have his video on, but Stephen, if you're there and you can talk from the Docker perspective, I'm also interested in hearing your take on it. He went unmuted, but I can't hear him. Stephen, if you're talking, I have no idea what you're saying.
He's not muted, but now we can hear him.
Yeah. Okay, well, so be it. It'll have to be a mystery whether Docker propagates response headers or not. But actually, I was interested because I think I will speak from what I know about Docker's implementation of things. Like, they make pretty extensive use of gRPC, and which makes me think maybe it would. Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, working. Okay. Yeah. So mostly all of our tracing would be through gRPC. Through the gRPC package right now. So, and any propagation of headers would be through either context or through the gRPC headers. So, but we're not that tightly integrated yet, right? I mean, and right now we're looking at going at using gRPC basically across the entire system. So all of our tracing kind of injection would be related to gRPC. Is that answering the question that you're looking for?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I was just Googling whether gRPC exposes response headers, and I think it uses them, but I don't think it exposes it. But anyway, we'll find out. Okay. Yeah, in general, I feel like it's hard to expect people to do it. It's possible to imagine them doing it, but it's hard to expect them to do it, and that just makes it problematic if you're trying to build capabilities around that. And I have enough trouble imagining the world getting even the request side of things fully instrumented, but I haven't stressed out about the response side. But if we could successfully get penetration across just the request side and get the kind of trees built, it seems like there's a lot of pretty profound things you can do beyond measuring latency and stuff that require that, and it would be great to see that happen. But I feel like it's sort of you have to crawl before you walk or something like that. And a lot of organizations don't even have basic coverage. That's always been my concern. But getting back to the parent of thing, I don't know. I mean, I can't remember if the issue actually includes a bunch of use cases or not. But I think that would be really helpful just to understand like from a, not even like something way back, you know, not to be too businessy about it, but like what's the sort of business value of having that, like what's it going to actually affect? It would be a lot easier to motivate to, like, you know, add something that could be kind of confusing.
Yeah, for what it's worth, like even with thinking through the use cases that we might use something like that, I actually agree with Jonathan that like the potential for use is just too high, and that risk and potential outweighs the use, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just to, I guess, as I was thinking more, so I do think we actually do send, so we do use the response headers in some cases, and we'll probably be using it more. The model that we use can support, say, like multiple flush scenarios, and it can support multiple flush scenarios. And so in that case, what we'd probably do is communicate an ID along back with each of the responses that we may send. But yeah, I guess, as was mentioned, like baggage, in general, the problems that we've had with any of these sort of like baggage propagation and stuff back up is like joining into the parent, and like it works really well in like tree RPC structures, but like really starts to break down really quickly. And we haven't been able to come up with like a conceptual model of, you know, what it would do. And it's just, I guess, like fearful of like people saying like, oh yeah, I need to transmit this like multi-megabyte thing around, as opposed to just like putting it in an argument or something.
I can see security implications that are worse from bubbling things up. It would be easier to leak things like GWIDs or whatever going that direction, given that it just sort of would automatically be propagating all the baggage, right? Like you're less likely to hit a public computer going down, more likely if you're going back up to the client.
That's a fantastic, I never thought about that. But yeah, the man in the middle scenario becomes so pretty bad at that point.
Yeah, even putting trace IDs in response headers is a similar kind of problem where you can have cross-customer traces or just expose like internal details about your tracing system to other people, and that's something we've run into where like people should clean the headers they expose to the public internet and then only provide response headers to the private internet and have some kind of Nginx rule for that, and that's like a bunch of hassle that, you know, some of our customers who are just automatically sending response headers to all their users aren't even realizing it's happening. And yeah, it's that part, yeah, you have to be real careful. Yeah.
Cue the OT header wire protocol bike shed, right?
Indeed.
Cool. Well, thanks for this feedback. This is all good food for thought. I guess I'll update the issue. But yeah, now I'm kind of thinking more this should just use the log interface. The main concern for trace is that I don't want to convert a whole lot of instrumentation that uses and propagates response headers to an OT model without losing information that we've been storing for a long time. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't remember there's an issue in GitHub, but there's definitely an issue in my head around the logging of references specifically. I'm absolutely positive it'll make some people angry if we start doing that. There's already a bunch of angst around like whether OpenTracing is like blowing up, you know, the Western world by having like, or the world in general by allowing logging into the API. And I think there's there's some recognition that it's valuable to log timestamp strings at times, but even like the presence of a key value facility is like kind of ruffles some feathers and ends up making some people feel like it's putting too much of a burden on implementations or something like that. I mean, I could argue with that, but I won't. However, like, I like the idea of saying, like, there's this reference, which is like a special thing in OpenTracing. It refers to another trace or another span in the same trace or whatever, and I want to just record it for, purposes of, I don't know, whatever, either something having to do with assembly or something to do with UIs. And like enshrining that, like if you say you want to log the reference right now, it would just be like stringified in some implementation specific way and wouldn't be meaningful. But I like the idea that like tracing implementations would have to understand logging a reference as like a kind of strongly typed thing. So you can bring that up if you want. I'm not going to bring it up because I've made too many people angry already about logging and stuff.
Yeah, I noticed in open context there's an add link. Oh, did I interrupt someone? Yeah, there's this. Oh, go ahead.
The log, like being able to see logs in context of traces, like that's super powerful from my perspective, and I really like it. The other thing I would mention that might, I think answering this might help direct where the implementation goes is, I remember, I think it was Ted who did the talk on measure, it was like measure once, or instrument once, measure 3 times or something like that. And I've been talking to a few folks, both around Twilio and some other companies, and I think that vision and notion of like, hey, we can have one set of instrumentation and be able to derive your metrics, your traces, and your logs. I think it's super powerful, but it's very, very early right now. But I think clarity around what is OpenTracing, and is it just purely about tracing workloads, or is it going to be trying to push into that instrument once, get multiple different things connected to that? Because I think that changes how you can think about the implementation and the API.
I mean, I can certainly share some of my thoughts on that subject. I feel like you say, I would argue that it's a thing that is early, but is happening naturally, and is going to continue, whether we push this idea or not, simply because as soon as you're in a distributed system, you start having to correlate all of these things. Like maybe the metrics not quite as much, but I don't know. As soon as you could start correlating your metrics and logs, I bet you'll find it to be really useful. And so it's sort of like the moment you add tracing to your system, that's your method of propagating those correlation IDs, whatever they are. Like that tracing system is the thing that's in charge of handling that. And so I think it will naturally start to suck in logging and metrics for that reason, because it's the thing that has whatever you're going to use to correlate these things. So in that respect, I kind of see it as a natural progression that's occurring. There's a separate question of like, well, what's OT's role in that? Like, are we supposed to do instrumentation that any tracer can plug into, and so we want to stay super limited and generic? Is it, or do we want to be more like kind of a proponent of doing things a certain way? And also, can we add observers or pluggable models to OpenTracing effectively? So, it's not like Zipkin and everything else suddenly now needs to deal with metrics. It's just like, okay, well, if you have something plugged in for the metrics, then it handles the metrics. And if you have something plugged in for the logs, it does. And if you don't, well, then we don't care about that. So that's sort of where I see it going. Stephen, I noticed you were trying to talk, so I'll shut up.
Oh, yeah. I was going to wait till you're finished. So if I'm, if I say anything wrong, I haven't been keyed into the OpenTracing community. So if I'm a little off here, let me know. But one issue I can see with binding the logs to tracing is that it's going to massively increase the data volume that's going to come out of a traced application. Whereas like span traces have a kind of a limited size, if you will, right? And whereas like once you start logging, and you start adding these key values, you can end up generating quite a bit of logs. And this is something we had in the registry where we would kind of do our tracing with logs and stuff like that. And it ended up being kind of operationally problematic just because of the volume of logs that when you bind the logging to the tracing, you end up with this like massive amount of data, and having to handle that inside of whatever target tracing platform will make those platforms more complicated. That's just one thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, I agree. There's always this aspect of like, what is the correct level of granularity, especially if you're going to say these are, I think it matters less for your application code because like you're kind of programming against specific implementations there, and it's okay to take them into account. But certainly when making like library instrumentation, yeah, there has to be some kind of rule about what's an acceptable amount of logging that system can do. It can now actually log, which you couldn't do in a library before, and so I think that's actually huge and important. And I think, again, if you look at what everyone's doing with their logs right now, they're trying to correlate them and get correlation IDs into their logs. So it's sort of like, I don't know that it's necessarily a different problem from the original how much logging should I be doing problem that everyone deals with, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just because you're now correlating it or a tracer got involved, it seems like it's the same problem. It always was.
Yeah, my kind of argument about the logging stuff is that, I mean, tracing, I would argue like there's only like event data and time series data and monitoring, and tracing is clearly like event data at the core. And logging is too. So logging and tracing are, you know, kind of sort of the same thing. And the main difference in practice seems to be that tracing systems understand a distributed transaction, and so they can sample based on transactions. And so you have like a lever with which to control log volume other than a verbosity. So you used to have the choice in the logging system of just saying, I just want the verbose logs, or I just want the warning logs, or whatever. But of course, if you actually want to look at an individual transaction, unless it was a warning or an error or something, you probably weren't going to see like all the details in a distributed system. So I think that like tracing just gives you this like transactional sampling or something like that as a lever to control the impact of the instrumentation on your you know, operationally, like as Stephen was saying. No argument, of course, that like if you don't even need logs, you could create a span for every function call, and you'll like overload your tracing system in just the same way. And just if you put more data in, you need to be able to handle more data. The thing that I think is nice about using tracing systems for logging is that you can still get like really fine-grained detail about some transactions, and then you can use sampling at a transaction level to control the impact on the tracing system. Rather than verbosity levels, which kind of like limit the use of your logging instrumentation. So like that's my like stump speech counter argument. And then of course you can have implementations that start dropping data when it just gets to be too much or whatever. And we did that in Dapper. And I'm sure a lot of industrial systems have done similar things to protect themselves.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that based on my experience at Twilio, the lack of having tracing actually created the problem of having too much logging. But once we added tracing in, then we could actually reduce our logging because it was more meaningful or surgical, I guess you could say, because of the context that you could see it in. But without tracing, it was like log the world all over the, you know. And I think our complexity is about 900 microservices at this point. So that is a lot of log data that it's very hard to sample, or you can't really sample it because it's a log system. So that's kind of how I think about it and what my experience has been so far.
And I do have this does bring up a concern for me with the current OpenTracing API around observers and correlation IDs, where it does seem like there's this great thing of being able to, okay, I got, my tracer doing some things, but I would also like to shunt the logs off into this log storage system. I would like to pump out some metrics to go into my metric system, all the usual kind of stuff, and to do that through some sort of observer API, so someone can just write, a Prometheus OpenTracing bridge, and you can just plug that in and configure it and make it work. There's a lot of interest in doing that. I know Yuri and some people have been working on observers. But it seems like the thing that you really want, like the whole point of that, has to do with basically span context information around the span ID and the trace ID. And we don't want to give those out right now. I can't really decide what they would look like. And that's sort of bringing up, well, should we add this correlation ID to make these things work? But then what is this correlation ID, and how is it feasible that we could add that but not give you the trace ID? So there's something that to me feels confused in that area, where we're trying to like hide information that we can't really hide on some level if we want to be successful. I don't have a great solution there. I won't try to solutionize in the middle of this call. But that is I think just an area where we need to, if we don't think hard, it's going to metastasize in some weird way.
I think that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make is that I think the clarity, the thing that will anchor the API and anchor OpenTracing is clarity on the scope of what it becomes. And I would encourage the board to think about, have an opinionated stance on the future of what it should be, and don't necessarily let it get there organically, because that's going to be much harder to rein in. And so I think it is that, at least right now, the way I think about it is it the instrument once, measure as many times as you want, or not, right? And I can see it going in either direction, but I think having an opinionated stance of what it is and why that is, weigh in on that, I think will help clarify kind of the direction and what should be in scope and out of scope. And from my 2 cents on this, I think that was like one of the very first things that people started noticing. It was like, oh, we have a whole lot of lines of code, or lines of instrumentation in our code now, because we have tracing, we have logging, we have all of our counters and gauges. And in small microservices, it was like there's more instrumentation code than there is business logic at this point. And so I think there is like for developers going through that instrumentation, there was a very obvious like gravitation towards doing that. Now, I think that's something to either get ahead of, to either stop or proliferate. But I think it should come out of this project in those opinions.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I think the one final thing I'll say is my opinion is how OpenTracing, because we want to be a standards organization, that means we really have to watch it with adding features to the API. And I personally would like to focus on trying to make the observer pattern work effectively for these kinds of use cases, because then it's just some minor, not minor, but some small thing around exposing or just threading this little needle about what is the minimal amount of information that tracers must give out to these observers so that they can actually do the kind of correlation they want to do. And if we can just solve that tiny piece of surface area, then that opens up, a sort of green field for people to go try to come up with various solutions for this that don't necessarily involve changing the OpenTracing API. So I see that as like the most fruitful potential way to move forward. I think the idea that we're going to add a fully baked like stats-D metrics, interface to OpenTracing or something, I feel like there'd be like a riot if we tried to do that.
So I have a question going back to your statement about like the ratio of business logic to instrumentation. I've noticed that there's not a whole lot of stuff in the OpenTracing community that focuses on auto instrumentation. most of the instrumentation is very manually applied and requires a lot of manual work on the application developer. Is there a reason for that, or is there an appetite for allowing some increased level of auto instrumentation?
There's that's definitely something that has come up at times. Like there is I believe like a OpenTracing, a Java agent based OpenTracing based thing that does the like the the less
yeah, it's very manual still at this point. It's more like a toolkit rather than a solution.
Yeah, I like, as a matter of personal opinion, like I'm a little bit skeptical about the automatic instrumentation of distributed systems working, at least for now. If someone can figure out a way to do it, like that's great. Like truly, it's more of a technical concern I have. Just almost like as an existence proof. If you look at vendors and like APM and stuff like that who've attempted to do this in distributed systems, in practice, they've usually run into like some pretty profound problems, especially the process boundary. And it's not like it can't be done. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying, but I think part of the concern is just been that it's so difficult to actually do it without having so many false positives that like your system isn't trustworthy. And that's been the concern that I've had. The other thing I would say is, like, if we wanted to take that approach, it might make more sense to focus on standards around wire formats and inter-process communication standards and stuff like that, and not so much around instrumentation, which then becomes much less important, since it's not like all the instrumentation is like this kind of black box thing. And I think there is some interest in moving in that direction for other reasons, and it might have the added benefit of like allowing for agent-based or automated instrumentation to fit in with OpenTracing compatible tracers. I don't know if that makes any sense, and I'm open to other views on this for sure. If someone thinks that they like, if someone's more bullish on being able to do this, I'm all ears.
I was more just kind of curious, or my thought was more on the lines of taking some of the existing instrumentation and figuring out a way to dynamically, automatically apply it, and that didn't seem like anyone was trying that yet. So,
right, like basically as a contrib project, right? You should be able to take this API and drive it in some automated way. I feel like people have dabbled with that. There's some aspect-oriented Java stuff going on somewhere at some point, wasn't there, Ben?
I think that's what I was just referring to.
okay.
Having used systems that automatically do this and seeing what kind of mess it becomes at scale, and then having to make developers do this, like I could see both ends, because on one end of the spectrum, we had so much instrumentation that it was useless. On the other end of the spectrum, now that we have a cat herding problem of trying to get everything to adopt in that sense. And so I certainly can see the two sides of that. But I would say, given the choice between those two worlds, I much prefer making an explicit decision on when you're going to add things in there, just because it's so hard to remove and clean up after the fact, that I much rather just talk to different teams and evangelize, and people start to see the value and just making that easy enough within your organization, versus like, hey, you got all this stuff for free, but nobody knows how to use it, and I can't see anything because there's just so much of it. So I've been in both. I've literally lived through both of those scenarios, and I could say at scale this one's better. I think at small scale, I can see the automatic one being beneficial, but then at that point, you don't have the tax of actually implementing it too much, because you're only at like tens of microservices. That makes sense.
Cool. Thanks for the feedback.
As for reducing the instrumentation overhead, there was this cool talk at Monotrama from Stripe about Veneur, which was like, they were like, here's a query in a Rails controller. You know, start a span, bump a count, log the query you're about to make the query, log the error if one occurred, you know, close the span, bump some other count with the timing in it, and then, you know, log the result of the query. And it was like 8 lines. And then he was like, but I can just do it in 1 line because of some fancy Rails monkey patching, but probably 2 lines would be the minimum you would imagine for some micro benchmark. And that was kind of cool. And then he's like, now my ops team can pick which of the 3 different reporting channels to use for that specific. If, you know, like if I have too many tags, then I can turn it down to events and just use logging. Or if I have too many spans, or I want to sample the trace, but sometimes make a count. And it was like a neat API that was totally a prototype. I think it was more like a pseudocode. Like there is in this Veneur project a OpenTracing bridge of some kind, but it's very alpha stage right now. But it was just a kind of glimpse into the future, potentially a way to do 2 or 3 of those concerns with a consistent single API that I thought was pretty cool.
So I'm taking a look at the clock. I think we have 2 minutes, and I do want to end on time since people probably have other things to do. I wanted to mention one other idea that I think we'll do. I think it's really helpful to have, and I especially wanted to thank, you know, Jonathan, Stephen, Bruce joining. It's great to have perspective from people who are consuming this type of technology. I thought it might be fun for the rest of the world, if not for us, to schedule like I don't know if it'd be quarterly or bi-monthly or something like that, but schedule like some sort of talk, maybe like a 30-minute presentation or maybe even an hour-long presentation where people would sort of present like tracing in practice at company X type of thing. I know when Adrian has organized his tracing workshops, those have been some of my favorite sessions, just like with hopefully with the veneer taken off and just explaining what did work and what was really difficult and how these problems were addressed and that sort of thing. I found that it varies a bit from company to company, and I thought it would be like a nice thing to host that and, you know, record the video and make it available for future reference from other folks. Do other people think that sounds valuable, or anyone who wants to say like, oh, absolutely not, like we shouldn't do that?
I think that sounds interesting too.
Yeah, it's like tracing is kind of a sexy technology, and I think it's getting a lot of buzz right now, but I don't think there's a lot of documentation out there of the pain points around it, and I think it would be helpful, like, just for the industry to like record where it goes awry and like where the problems tend to be. I think most of it honestly has to do with instrumentation, but I would love to get those stories like kind of recorded, and maybe we can even revisit, you know, the same company once every 18 months and see how things have changed or not or whatever. So, all right, well, we'll try and set something like that up. I don't know who the initial victim will be, but it should be informal and everything, but I think it would be interesting. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. This has been really interesting, and I guess, you know, we'll see everyone next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. See y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.